Hello, Alistair Leinster from Useful Projects. Just responding to Neil's sort of petal green belt, as it were, and to the risk issue. Given that we've seen after the M25 was built, it was basically full, they had to make it bigger straight away. The London Overground opened as an orbital system, that was basically massive increase. Doesn't that show there's a suppressed demand for more orbital movement around the city rather than always going towards and through the centre? Should we not think about creating more strategic rail, orbital outer rail, to link around to make London more resilient if central London becomes congested? So we're addressing greater suppressed demand and making London more resilient.
Great. So the proposition is for a big Orbi rail, not the original one, but something even bigger and bolder than the London Overground. Please think about that, panellists. Who else wants to come in?
I was interested in the proposal about the growth corridors coming out of London into the wider southeast and the radial green belt, and just wondering how you would go about involving the politicians outside London in those sort of decisions.
That's a great question. Neil, we'll ask you to pick that one up if you would. Who else?
Wouldn't it be a good idea to utilise rail in the Lower Thames crossing as well as road?
The sort of mega city supported by transit is something I think we haven't really experienced. I'd be very interested to understand whether you could do a risk assessment to understand the kind of risk associated with this very new type of development. And I'm also interested in how you really capture that value uplift that Jerome talked about in terms of the wider social environmental benefits that accrue when you get good mixed-use development.
I think it was Neil's first comment that he didn't see any debate about what kind of city do we want to have in 2050. How do we get that debate going? Because we have quite a macho culture when it comes to these things, and I think that debate perhaps is viewed as a bit soft. How do we get that going?
If you could pick up 2 or 3 points each, that would be great. Neil, why don't you go first?
Okay, to pick up the point about orbital rail systems, I'd move that on slightly and say that we have to develop our network thinking about how we join up all forms of transport. Boris Bikes has been tremendously successful. The Oyster card has been tremendously successful as well. So I'd almost transform your question into the fact that we need to think about networking everywhere up. I think that KPMG proved that if you improve the transport capacity by 10%, you can actually get a 14% increase in employment density. And so I think if we can join things up better, and I think the Overground is a very good example of taking fragments and making them into a network, and I would totally support there being further orbital systems of some sort. We'll see very good things for Britain. Just to go to the second point, and perhaps touch on the third one, I was being provocative. Sometimes I don't know the answer to these questions. I don't know how we get our politicians to lead us in a debate about what kind of London we want. And I think the level of political debate we have in the country is very poor, as a personal observation. I raised the point about the regional aspect of London because I also don't know the answer to that. I'm no politician, but I know there's an issue here. And earlier vote showed how many people in this room have come from outside of London. We can't just draw a arbitrary red line around London and say that is the kind of system. We have to think in a different way about how we govern London, what we want London to be, and I think what we want the kind of southeast of the country to be. And finally, I'd say it's the southeast of Britain, which is actually the economic unit, which is competing with the rest of the world. And I think we've got to realise that too, that if we don't get these questions sorted, and if we don't have this vision of the region, we're going to fall behind.
Lower Thames crossing, including rail, I think that would be a fabulous idea. Short answer there. Secondly, outer London or London orbital rail, well, it's been explored many times, and I think there's no doubt that it would bring benefits. The difficulty is making sure that the route for such a thing actually enables it to capitalize on the hubs that it might create, if you like. If you take it too far out, it's difficult to generate enough development on the back of it. If you bring it into London, you're talking about vast tracts of land that will be needed to make it happen. So there is a challenge with actually bringing it to fruition and the reality behind it, but I do believe that there is an argument for further exploration. I think this point that was raised, I think, by Dan about the way in which you capture benefits earlier, well, this really is at the heart of what I was trying to convey in my pitch, which is effectively that through a better interface between public and private, perhaps sitting somehow in the same sort of organisational structure, you can start to share some of the benefits earlier across sector. So, for example, if you imagine a new piece of infrastructure being built, it very often takes a long, long time before a developer can realise the development above or around that piece of infrastructure because the core construction works need to be undertaken first. But we do see that development occurs or land value increase occurs outside the red line in many of those instances. So if, for example, the public sector are able to involve the private sector in capitalising on some of those land value-driven development opportunities outside the red line sooner, then those same developers would be able to recycle funds back into the project sooner and perhaps enable the public sector to deal with some of its balance sheet issues and particularly paying back loan-type repayments quicker and earlier in the development cycle. That, to me, is the perfect public-private partnership that we should be exploring.
I think I mentioned about this flexibility and not being able to predict what the next big event is. So it's vital to be nimble, but for people to work together. One example of this is business in the community. So we work with, it's a Prince's Trust charity, business in the community, and part of that is the Business Emergency Recovery Group. So there's one for central London, and it's all the organisations getting together to think about events and think about risks and think about the response and the recovery. And I used the example of that today with the potential for terrorist attacks. So, you know, this collaboration and the loss scenario work is essential, and it's making sure that everybody's thinking and preparing and planning. But no one can do this in isolation. As I said, it's local services, infrastructure, businesses. If you've got people living and working in the same place, then yeah, it's very much everyone working together. But there's many examples around the world, but the United Nations also have their Resilient Cities campaign. So we work with them, and part of that is particularly in relation to natural catastrophes and becoming more resilient to natural catastrophe events. But just within Marsh, you know, we think of ourselves as we're risk advisors, of course we are, and we're working with cities and businesses, but we're also city members. So we have offices around the world. So we are working within the local environment where our offices are based in terms of that resilience. So it is this business in the community idea and the collaboration which is required, but it is all about preparation and being flexible as in terms of what's coming.
Great, well thank you very much indeed. I think this has been a really vibrant and interesting session, and what I'd like you to do is join me in thanking Neil Bennett, Jerome Frost and Caroline Woolley. Thank you very much indeed.